In this tutorial, we'll be looking at the cutoff versus button 2-bet pot formation, and we'll focus a bit more on the 5-span high boards. So here we've got a database of 15 flops spanning from ace high to queen high, and all of these are 5-span high. So 5-span meaning that there is 5 possible ranks on the turn which would complete a straight. So for example, on the ace-jack 7, looking here, let's load in the ace-jack 7. On the ace-jack 7, the king, the queen, the 10 can complete a straight, can complete some kind of Broadway straight. And between the jack and the 7, there's also the 9 and the 8 that can complete some kind of Broadway straight. So on ace-jack 7, that's a 5-span board. Looking at some other hands, some other boards, this king 6-4. On the king 6-4, between the 4 and the 6, the 2, the 3, the 5, the 7, and the 8 can complete some kind of straight. Just because it's labeled 5-span, that doesn't necessarily mean that both players actually have all the possible straight draws. It's just a form of categorization. And definitely for both players on the higher kind of board cards, there's going to be more possible straights than on the lower board cards. Digging into the ranges for each player and digging into the equities, the cutoff here on these 5-span boards, where generally there's two kind of lowish cards, there's going to be a lot of checking, right? In contrast here, there's queen 10 when there's two high cards. There's a fair amount of betting. Looking at the betting frequency, it's checking 58% of the time on the queen and the 10. So that means it's going to be betting at about 42%. But for the remaining boards, it's a very high checking frequency. Overall, it's going to be over 85%. I'm getting close to 90%. If we remove this queen 10 5-span board, we'll probably get closer to 90% checking frequency overall. Ace-jack stands out a little bit because ace-jack is two broadways, but you also got to remember that ace-jack specifically is one of the offsuit hands that the button will flat at the cutoff here, and so that means the button's going to have a fair amount of ace-jack 2 pairs as well as a set of 7s. So we can go and have a look at some of these boards and looking at the sort of checking frequency and the betting strategy for the cutoff. So let's go and drill into king 7-5. That looks a bit interesting. King 7-5 rainbow. So here we're looking at the king 7-5 rainbow. Bet size about half pot is being liked by this simulation. The 7-5, where are the straight draws? There's this 8-6 open-ended straight draw. There's the 6-4 open-ended straight draw. That's a very low frequency open for the cutoff. And there's the handful of gut shots, the 9-8 and the 9-6. But other than that, it's pretty dry. So here on this king 7-5, relatively high checking frequency. And then when the cutoff checks the button, because they have the set of 7s and the set of 5s, is going to bet into the cutoff at a reasonably high frequency to just deny equity from all of the Broadway type hands that have just missed this king. So certainly the cutoff has hit some of the king, and so that's why they're betting out at a decent frequency given that they're behind in equity. They have hands like the ace king, which does really well, and so like that value range is going to be very ace king heavy. So looking here at the top pair that's in there, there's a fair amount of ace king that's being put into there, and king queen as well. Some of the wicker king X being thrown in there as well because this size isn't super big, and so some of the hands will benefit from betting and then checking on a later straight some of those top pair hands. And also the cutoff's got aces as well. Let's have a look at what happens after the cutoff checks. So reasonably high checking frequency throughout these board types. There's a mixture of different sizes depending on the board type. So you see this 1.5 pot bet. It's happening more frequently on the ace-x boards. There's this pot size bet happening reasonably on the ace-x and some of the queen-x boards. And then this small bet is happening more on the king high boards and the lower queen high boards, right? So what is that telling us? That's telling us that an ace in particular is something that we're going to look at and how we're going to be playing in the button position when we flop one of these board types where we've got like ace 8-6. So let's have a look at that. So here, ace 8-6. In terms of the overall equity on the ace 8-6, here down at 47.31% for the cutoff, which means that the cutoff range is pretty far behind here. And once the cutoff checks to the button, the cutoff can very easily make a mistake of betting too frequently, and if they bet too frequently, they're just going to get raised to a very big size. There's the pot size raised there. But if they check, the main bet size here for the button is 1.5 times a pot. And so what's really going on when you're betting 1.5 times a pot? But you're saying that you've flopped a set, or there's a little bit of ace-8 here. But the main thing is that you're saying that you flopped a set and you're trying to get value from an ace. That's really what's going on, and you're declaring that on the flop. And these ace-high boards are pretty nice to do that with, because the Cutoff's opening range is fairly ace-x heavy. And because it's fairly ace-x heavy, they'll hit a lot of top pairs here. All of these top pairs will be fairly weak. The button's calling range has also got some top pairs in it as well, so the button can actually check back those top pairs to defend on the turn. And so the button's check backs with those top pairs and checking back with some of those other pocket pairs in their range means that their check back range will be reasonably well defended. Doesn't really have to check back too many sets, and so those sets can just bet the flop and try and get value from the Cutoff's ace-x combinations. There is a little bit to be said about getting these weaker gut shots to fold. There's a fair amount of gut shots on the 8-6, so getting some of them to fold by making this big bet on the flop is beneficial when you've got a set, just because that improves the overall equity, the number of different turn and river runouts that are fairly clean for the set. In contrast, if you're betting a bit smaller, those gut shots are going to continue all the time, and so like when those gut shots complete, it gets a bit dicey for the set. So yeah, the set really wants to bet big, pile some money in, and get called by these top pairs. And looking at the defense against this overbet on the flop, the Cutoff has to call with some of these pocket pairs below the ace, between the ace and the 8, with the intention of just calling them to actually try and draw to a set themselves a lot of the time, or just become a pure bluff catcher, right? So that's really what's going on with these pocket pairs here. They're absolutely bluff catching, and they do have a 2-out draw to a set, which beats the button's sets and top pairs. And so those kinds of ranks will be reasonably defended. They're not going to be super bricky for the Cutoff, although they will be slightly underrepresented. So let's have a look at the calling range, and then the turn report on the calling range, and see if there's any donks. Donking a fair bit on a king, donking a bit on the ace, donking a bit on the 8 and the 6. So what is it saying? Looking at the equity again, what is it saying when you're donking on these boards? This is saying that, okay, either part of my range is improved, and now I don't necessarily believe that you've got 2-pair or better, or some of my 2-pair has materialized. So on a king, you get ace king, you get pocket kings coming in. On an 8, that blocks a fair amount of the sets for the button. On a 6, that blocks some of the sets for the button. And definitely on an ace, that blocks on the 2 pairs for the button, right? So when those turn cards come through, you can just bet the flop. So donk bet the turn as the Cutoff here. So we'll have a look at the king quickly just to see what's going on there. Yeah, like this betting range is very much 2-pair heavy. This ace king, king 6, and there's the trips with the set of kings, 8s and 6s. And also there's some top pair being thrown in there as well. Like you bet small, you're going to get raised at fairly high frequency because the button's range is so polar. And then on this king, some of the bluffs from the flop will have made, and so those kinds of hands will want to do checking back. And it's going to be a little more difficult for those bluffs to actually outdraw a hand like ace king, but they still might be able to outdraw an ace by drawing to a 2-pair, for example. And obviously the pocket pairs can also check back to try and outdraw ace king by drawing to a set. So a little bit of equity denial by making that small bet there. If there was a smaller bet in the simulation on the turn, then that very small bet might be used sometimes as well. Okay, let's have a look at another kind of board, looking at the check line, maybe look at this pot size bet. Ace 9 7, same kinds of reasons. Queen 10 2, I guess we can look at Queen 10 2. Okay, so Queen 10 2. So the ace, the king, the jack, the 9, the 8 can potentially complete some straights. On the Queen 10, there's a lot of top pair and middle pair for the Cutoff, but the button has stronger top pairs on average, stronger middle pairs on average, and a fair amount of 2-pair. When the Cutoff checks, it's this 2-pair, the Queen 10, and the set of 2s, the set of 10s, that are really going to be the bulk of the value range. And also the button's flatting like ace queen and king queen pre-flop, and so they'll make it in there as well sometimes. So nice big chunky pot size bet. on the flop into this cutoff checking range, is reasonably condensed cutoff checking range. Remember, like the cutoff, because they've hit the queen, they've hit the 10 reasonably well. Their range is very heavy in just one pair hands, and a lot of those one pair hands are going to be pretty weak, right? So like you got middle pair or top pair with a weak kicker. So when the cutoff checks, right, it's really up to the button to push and put a lot of pressure on those middling hands by making this big bet. Same kind of thing can be said on ace, where on that previous ace-x board, where you've got ace-8-6 or ace-9-7 or ace-6-5, something like that, where the cutoff checks and the button is saying, okay, you've checked, so you probably got an ace or a pocket pair below the ace. I'm going to make these big bets into you to really put pressure on those those one pair hands when the button here is called preflop with a lot of pocket pairs, and so can hit sets reasonably on those boards and two pairs reasonably on those boards. So here, this is another example of that. Queen 10-2, there's a lot of queen x and 10x in the range. So those one pair hands are fairly middling. And now the button, when the cutoff checks, the button is going to make this pot size bet to put pressure on those hands here. So here's on the top pair are starting to fold. These weaker top pairs these top pairs with a weaker kicker, these middle pairs, they're all starting to be indifferent at this stage because the button is representing mostly two pairs and sets for value. Looking at the value range, sets 8.73% set, 7.01% two pair, and these top pairs are like the big top pairs. Very little bit of queen jack in there, which probably checks back the turn at a reasonably high frequency. So that, I guess, you can consider to be the value component. This is going to be 8 plus 7 plus 15. That's about 30% in this pot size bet value. And then the remainder is going to be bluffs and semi-bluffs. These weak pairs here being used as semi-bluffs. There's some strong draws in terms of these flush draws are fairly strong flush draws. Drawing to, so for example here, ace jack, this is just a raw draw. Ace jack, king jack suited, they're just raw draws. And then some of these ace x draws are just a nut flush draw. So they're all nice and strong to be used as a very strong semi-bluff, almost for value at that stage against a single one pair hand, because they've got the nut flush draw as well as that overcard, which gives it a substantial amount of equity, and basically it draws the nuts on the turn about a quarter of the time. And if it doesn't draw the nuts on the turn, it can often check back on the turn and then also get a draw on the river as well, a cheap draw on the river. And then these weaker pairs being thrown in there, because on those lower ranks you want to be able to get some additional value by drawing to a set. So pot size bet, those pocket pairs fold, right? And so there's not really going to be too much of an advantage or disadvantage for drawing to those lower ranks. Say for example, a 5. The 5 is a massive brick, none of the straights got there, and the cutoff checks their entire range, and the button now is going to keep betting, another pot size bet with a lot of strong hands. This queen jack is starting to check back at a pretty high frequency. The king jack is also, sorry, the king queen is also checking back at a pretty high frequency, but all the sets basically just keep giving on betting this pot size bet. This new turn set with the set of 5s is being used, and looking at it from this view, you can see that this is the value component, this king queen up. And so what's that, about 40-ish, 45-ish% of the range on the turn for this pot size bet is this value component on this kind of brickish 5. And then what bluffs are being used, it's like a lot of this ace high with some flush draw stuff. All the flush draws are actually checking back. So most of the flush draws are betting, but some flush draws are checking back, because you do need some flush draws to check back the turn to be able to draw to the river. Otherwise, if you just bet all your flush draws on the turn, after you check back the turn and a flush comes in, your opponent would never believe that you have a flush, and you don't really get any value from your opponent betting too high, too frequently when the flush comes in, if you just don't have any flushes in your range. But yeah, the flush draws keep on betting. The 5 doesn't really change anything, so the cutoff's range is still very condensed with just a bunch of one pair type hands. Sure, they've got a little bit of two pair plus, but mostly it's going to be one pair. A little bit of the kings and aces. And obviously they're going to have difficulty calling the flush draws as well, right? They can't overweight the flush draws in their calling range, otherwise they don't get any value. Say for example, the flush comes in the river, they're going to check and then get jammed into, and then the flushes call to protect there. So if you've got too many flushes, your opponent just won't bet into you. Okay, what else is there? That kind of explains that. I don't want to talk about that for too long. Looking at some other stuff on these kinds of boards. Is there anything interesting? Let's look at this Queen 6-4. Queen 6-4 is similar to that ace A7-5 we looked at. Was it A7-5? Ace 8-6 we looked at. So Queen 6-4, what's going on? Queen 6-4, like the cutoff is just doing really poorly in terms of equity here, down at 45%, checking the entire range. There's not a lot going on. The cutoff has missed a lot of those Broadway hands. Obviously, the Queen X stuff has made a top pair, but with the 6 and the 4 down, there's not a lot of 2 pairs. There's a bit of a Queen 6, that's about it. There's no Queen 4. With the 6 and the 4, and the fact that the cutoff here has got, so the button's got a lot of Queen X in their range, the button here is going to want to bet small to just deny a whole lot of equity from the ace high, king high, jack high type hands that have just missed. And these pocket pairs will benefit from denying that small amount of equity from 2 overcard hands. So they're betting small and then raising a lot. Very similar to the previous 4-span low type boards that we looked at in the previous lesson. So hopefully that makes sense. So here checking and then looking at the betting frequencies, like why we're overbetting on the ace and why we're making these pot size bets on some of the ace and the queen 10. Because like when the cutoff flops a lot of middling hands, the button flops a lot of strong hands in terms of sets and 2 pairs, that's the spot where you're going to be overbetting once the cutoff checks, or making this pot size bet once the cutoff checks. But if the cutoff here on this Queen 6-4, King 6-4, King 7-5, A7-4 to a lesser degree, but on these kinds of boards here where the cutoff flops a single Broadway card, meaning that a lot of the cutoff's preflop range is actually missed, and the button has those sets, the set of 7s, set of 5s, set of 4s, set of 6s, and some of the, there's not going to be a lot of the 2 pairs, but definitely those particular sets, and the other pocket pairs above the 7 and the 5. What that means is that the button will want to bet at a reasonably high frequency with those other pocket pairs, protected reasonably by the sets, and bet at a high frequency for a small size just to deny that little bit of equity from the cutoffs Broadway type hands that have just missed the flop. Let's have a look at one more example of each just so you guys can get the picture. King 6-4. Okay. Have a look at this one already? No, I don't think so. So King 6-4, right? Equity's not doing too bad. There's some ace king, but checking at a reasonably high frequency, and then the button is betting a lot. The button's betting a lot. A lot of the ace highs are folding, these queens high are folding, these jack highs are folding. And so a lot of these just high card hands are folding this to this flop size, to this small flop bet. Remember, alpha for a quarter pot bet is 20%, they're folding 28%. There's some check back EV in terms of the bluffs that the button is using, and there's some benefit for denying equity on this kind of flop by betting small. On the other hand, let's look at another overbet board. So it's King 6-4, and let's have a look at Ace 6-4, right? Now on the Ace 6-4, because the cutoff has so many more top pairs compared to the King 6-4, right? They open Ace 9 off, Ace 8 off, Ace 5 off, Ace 2 suited, right? There's a lot more top pairs, right? The button is starting to go for an overbet now, right? This is a bit of a mixed picture. There's this small bet still happening to deny equity from king high, queen high type hands. But because the cutoff range is less air and more condensed weak pairs, not necessarily weak pairs, condensed top pairs with a weak kicker, or just a whole bunch of just top pairs, the button's sets will want to go for this overbet, right? So in fact, in this particular spot, you've got a combination of betting small to deny equity, overbetting to get value when you've got a set. So like this betting small needs to get raised a lot, right? It's getting raised about 13, 14% of the time, about 13% of the time. It's getting raised a lot when there's a continue, and then there's going to be overbetting on the turn most likely. And then this flop overbet is not getting raised at all. And then some of the top pairs are starting to fold, right? So just looking at the relative value component, bunch of top pairs and pocket pairs below the ace being used, I guess you could say, as the value component for this small bet size. These pocket pairs are mergy, that they're betting small to just deny equity from overcard type hands. And then looking at the 1.5 pot bet, much more polar, very much sets is the value range. And then these strong top pairs betting the flop for value, likely to check back at some stage on a later straight. And then maybe one more just so we can get a better idea about the situation. 9-7, made a little top pair with on the S9-7, checking, and now making this pot size bet with the sets and the two pairs, the S9, the set of 9s, the set of 7s, and also some of the ace queen. Hopefully that makes sense. You can look at some of the differences between these high kind of boards with potential straight draws. Main thing to notice is whether there's kind of two Broadway cards or just one Broadway card with a bunch of low cards, or whether there's an ace, because an ace changes things significantly just because of the amount of ace X that the cutoff opens in this particular formation. That the cutoff's going to open a lot of ace X, and so it's going to flop a lot of top pairs. But if it's a king or a queen, a lot of that ace X is missed, and so betting small to no equity from that ace X is usually a good thing to do. All right, in the next lecture, next tutorial, we'll look at the 5-span high boards a bit more, and then we'll follow on into some of the turn play, probably some of the turn play after we've overbet the flop. I think that would be interesting. So thanks for listening to this lecture, and I will talk to you in the next one. Bye now.